What makes a good character? Now already that's a pretty vague question, because there's several different aspects that make up every single character. So what makes them necessarily good? And no, I'm not talking about your run-of-the-mill, saving the world type protagonist. Rather, I'm more talking about characters who are compelling to follow. Characters that, despite their several flaws and questionable decisions, are still strong, interesting, and entertaining. Because let's be honest, perfection can be kind of boring. But generally, good characters often consist of three major factors: personality, relatability, and development. Personality is pretty standard. A good character needs to have an interesting character at its core. What is their backstory, their disposition, their motivations, simple elements that make up a unique, interesting character. Meanwhile, relatability is just having the character feel realistic. Actions and decisions that make sense to the character no matter how down-to-earth or extraordinary they may be. Simply put, these characters need to resonate with the audience while also not becoming too dull or unrelatable. And finally, how does the character develop throughout the story? What conflicts must they face and how do they resolve them? How does their relationships with other characters grow closer or crumble apart? It's those evolutions to the character that makes them feel authentic. Developments that transform the character while staying true to their core. Now obviously, there's a multitude of intricacies that make the best of characters. But personally, this is what I'm looking for in what I consider a good character. And this brings us to the great Ace Attorney, because that overly long introduction is for one singular character. A character that, despite only really being present for 25% of the entire game, is still featured prominently on the box art, promotional material, and fan art. Someone that was even voted by fans as the best character in the entire game. That character being the one, the only, Kazuma Asogi. The samurai with a mission whose mission ended quite prematurely. But it is intriguing to me. In a game that has so many entertaining and complex characters, why is he seen as the best among them? Especially one with very little screen time in comparison. Now it could easily be his superficial qualities. A cocky, ambitious character with a slick design, imposing aesthetic, and tight relationship with the main character is only asking for fan service. But looking deeper into his character and story reveals a far more complex side to his character. From your classic, perfect mentor type character to a much darker side that's concealed away. And as the cracks begin to unfold, how do they slowly start to corrode not just himself, but also those closest to him? This is the story of Kazuma Asogi. Our story begins like any good lawyer backstory. You immediately accuse a murder with a smoking gun in your hands and must stand trial in front of a grand jury. You know, your average Tuesday for our Ace Attorney game. And it's there where we're first introduced to our man of the hour, Kazuma Asogi. And already we're given a pretty good look at who he is. His entrance immediately fills the entire room as he showcases his quick-wittedness, pungent tone, and dominant demeanor to disperse the bailiff. But most importantly, this marks the beginning of who Ryunosuke knows Kazuma as. A friend. This introductory scene does a good job establishing their close bond with one another, but also the significance of this trial for the both of them, Ryunosuke to be proven innocent and Kazuma to be accepted for his London trip. And the trial itself would only further demonstrate how strong their bond truly is. Ryunosuke is left like a deer in headlights, having to lead the entire defense with no prior experience as a lawyer. But Kazuma is right there to support him, whether it's through friendly banter or quick advice when necessary. Now this first case is structured like our other first case duos from previous games, but here, Ryunosuke and Kazuma's relationship is a lot different, because the case portrays them as being close friends and builds upon that. Their ability to naturally bounce off one another and pick each other up during tough situations is a testament to that. It makes their relationship feel a lot more compelling and really gets us invested into these characters, especially with the development Ryunosuke has during this trial. And throughout all of these events, it only builds Kazuma's prestige even further, exemplifying his kindness, determination, and just plain badassery. However, there's still a catch. For one, this trial is portrayed to almost be more about Kazuma rather than yourself. You know, the guy who's standing trial for murder. Everyone makes it clear the significance of Kazuma and his trip to London, leading to Mikotomo pushing Ryunosuke to take on the entire defense for Kazuma's sake. And of course, being the good friend he is, Ryunosuke complies, but it's still a strange moment. Jeopardizing your entire life to ensure a study abroad tour for Kazuma, especially when Kazuma's seemingly the best lawyer there is. It just characterizes their entire relationship as merely Ryunosuke playing second fiddle to Kazuma, how his life is expendable because Kazuma's the one important. And secondly, there's still more to Kazuma than meets the eye. At the end of the case, we have a short talk of Kazuma, and he's clearly holding something back before being interrupted, concealing something that we have no idea of but are expected to follow along with nonetheless. Now, these details may seem insignificant at first, but as the story progresses, the more these events will be put into question. But at last, Ryunosuke agrees to help Kazuma with his so-called favor. Little to his knowledge, that agreement would have some devastating news awaiting him on the other side. A couple months pass, and Ryunosuke wakes up from a rough sleep, only to find himself once again shackled and accused for another murder. Looks like you got yourself some competition there, Maya. However, that would not be the worst news we wake up to. The death of Kazuma is very sudden, and it's honestly quite shocking considering all the setup from the previous case. But while this would be perceived as just a way to pass the torch on to Ryunosuke, there's another significant thing his death causes. It cements Kazuma's legacy. We got to see his likable personality, his tenacious ambitions, and most importantly, the impact he left on others, mainly Ryunosuke. And so, his premature death would only accentuate those feelings of him, who already had such an altruistic presence in the first place. It glorifies him so much that he's perceived as basically perfect, and that legendary perception of him will continue to persist throughout the entire game. But the case does continue, everyone from Ryunosuke to Suzuto now seemingly empowered with the same tenacity as Kazuma, all to discover one simple thing: what happened to Kazuma? And after a ton of investigation and meeting new characters, the case was quickly concluded, and it would seem that Kazuma's death was merely accidental. A misunderstanding and a reactionary shove to the back, and that was it. Kazuma was gone. A tragedy that only caused sorrow for everyone involved, and one that could never be undone. But could that really be the end? And especially someone of Kazuma's pedigree, it's no wonder there will still be a lot of unresolved emotions. Suzuto is still distraught, Hosonaga is running with guilt, and Ryunosuke is just empty. Because his best friend was still gone, and all of his dreams along with him. And he has to feel guilty in some way, as he was passed out the entire time Kazuma was subsequently killed. But Kazuma's legacy must be continued. And all those unresolved emotions would lead to what comes next. Ryunosuke was to pick up where Kazuma left off, to continue this London trip as Kazuma and fulfill those goals once preached by his best friend. He was to become a lawyer. No matter how much adversity he must face, he will carry on the soul of Kazuma, both figuratively and literally. And as he dons Kazuma's armband and katana kuruma, Ryunosuke is now the lawyer in charge. And normally this would be where Kazuma's story would end. However, that really isn't the case. Kazuma continues to be an influence because of that legacy he established, the legend that is now flowing through Ryunosuke. And that legend he crafted up to this point almost makes Kazuma feel more alive than ever. Meanwhile for Ryunosuke, his journey is just beginning, to prove he is as capable as Kazuma once was. And those old memories and wise words of Kazuma will be what helps him push through even the toughest of cases. That same drive and motivation that he knew Kazuma once possessed. But with each passing flashback, Kazuma's voice would begin to fade. That old image of his best friend only becoming foggier and foggier. That is until one prominent case. The return of the great departed soul begins with Ryunosuke reclaiming his right to represent people. It's a long story, so don't question more about it. But then, he catches wind of some events involving Van Zieks and a new assistant he has. And as he visits Van Zieks' office, he recognizes a familiar presence from his new apprentice. Someone of mysterious origins, yet still strikes a chord with him nonetheless. And this will begin to plant the seed of, well, holy shit, Kazuma's alive. I mean, it's basically in the title now thinking about it. And during Suzuto's ventures back in Japan, again, long story, she too would get some damning news. She would learn that Kazuma's body seemingly went missing in Hong Kong, and the government has since covered it up, even erecting a fake grave for him in his honor. And this would inevitably leave the both of them to conclude that Kazuma may still be alive. And while there's a ton of implications with this predicament, like a certain Sholmes lying to us about his murder, there's a specific moment that I would like to highlight. This small moment is just a testament to their characters as well as their grief for Kazuma even all these months later. And seeing them unable to be optimistic despite all the evidence, all because they're fearful of it not being true, is honestly a devastating scene to witness. But it's a thought that will have to simmer into their next interaction, which will be a couple days later when investigating the crime scene, now with Suzuto. And upon seeing the apprentice one more time, Suzuto immediately freezes, only for her to shout out in response, Now, a scene like this could easily downplay the actual twist, basically confirming his identity but still concealing it till the end. But here I feel like it works incredibly well, because we're given ample time to deduce his identity on our own, but not at the cost of the characters. These are incredibly smart characters, so them not following up a suspicion, especially one so personal to them, would just make them look dumb and incompetent. But we wouldn't have an answer until after the trial concludes and Van Zieks invites us for a little meeting in the courtroom. For context, this entire trial is embroidered in the mystery surrounding the professor, one of London's most notorious serial killers, as well as the secrets that the government is desperately trying to hide about him. And finally, one of those secrets will be revealed right now. As the key turns and the mask drops, the identity of the professor is finally front and center. And he is a Japanese male. But not just any man. And just then, a bottle drops, and the apprentice lets out a shrieking yell, ripping off his cloak and marching towards the wax figure. And as the apprentice reaches for his mask, it is only then when he is finally reborn.
Kazuma! My best friend, Kazuma Asogi. After a whole year, finally his memories returned. As he stood there before me, Ryunosuke. Hello again. My friend.
Kazuma-sama!
Judicial Assistant Mikotoba. It's been a very long road. Thank you. Thank you for guiding my friend here when I could not.
It was an honor.
Now, as great as this reunion is, there's still one thing I feel I should mention. This isn't really Kazuma, or rather the Kazuma we knew him as. Let me explain. We saw nothing but good things from him personally, and thus we're more than willing to continue forth his dreams he preached about so much. But really, did we even know what his true intentions were? We don't even know the full extent of his goals besides the vague changing our legal system stuff that, while it's a large statement by itself, it comes across as more like a flimsy politician statement than an actual ambition. Ryunosuke even says something similar in this second case. But his true intentions would only follow him to his grave. And so, other than what we knew on a surface level, we knew practically nothing about him. We were just blinded by his altruistic facade and just trusted we knew him deep down, when in reality, we never knew who Kazuma truly was. But by that same notion, we could also say that this really isn't Ryunosuke either. He made his entire mission to become Kazuma, becoming a lawyer, taking care of Kuruma, and continuing this voyage to London. His entire mission was essentially to be a vessel for Kazuma's soul, to complete what Kazuma set out to do. But it also meant that throughout this entire story so far, Ryunosuke is merely acting like Kazuma. He burdened himself with all of these responsibilities in order to pursue the same mission as Kazuma. Keep in mind, none of these are directly Ryunosuke's, not his goals, ideals, not even his own mission. Everything was instead inherited through Kazuma. And so everything he did was solely to replicate what Kazuma would do. And this has been a pattern for Ryunosuke throughout, always being overshadowed by Kazuma, whether it's by others or Ryunosuke himself devaluing himself in comparison. And it means that Ryunosuke is always chasing something that he isn't, but also never reaching those peaks Kazuma seemingly was at. Even him saying things like this was Kazuma's journey, or you were impressed by Kazuma. Ryunosuke ingrained in his own mind the idea that Kazuma is the one important, not himself. And his own flawed mentality basically meant he never had any agency to pursue his own legacy. Instead, he is shackled by his own admiration of Kazuma to choose imitation rather than evolution. And keep in mind, none of this is meant to be a slight against Ryunosuke, quite the contrary. But he has yet to finally discover his own purpose independent from Kazuma's. And with Kazuma's return, who really is Ryunosuke now? His job is finished. Where else does he go from here? But alas, that idealistic form of Kazuma that we have experienced and accepted up till now will finally begin to crack. As Kazuma approaches a wax figure of his father and in rage slices it cleanly in half. And with one last,
I'll be seeing you,
he sets off, leaving Ryunosuke and Suzuto in the courtroom left to ponder. I feel like it's important to mention how one of the major themes in this game is all about the idea of deception. How not everyone is what they seem, even those who you trust the most. But that theme goes even further, because everyone has their own secrets, but how far should one go to uncover them, let alone if they should even be exposed at all. But once they're out there, what now? When even the smallest of reveals can have the biggest of consequences. It's a theme that I would like you to keep in mind proceeding forward. But that brings us to Twisted Karma and his last bow, where Kazuma has since gone missing as we meet with Jigoku and Mikotoba to learn more about his father, Genshin Asogi. Okay, come on. Really? Genshin? I guess you could say Genshin really made an impact on London. Anyways. We learn more about Genshin and how he was once a well-respected exchange student and good friend of theirs. That is until one day when he was ousted as a professor and executed. There aren't many details afterwards, but clearly to Kazuma, there's still more to this story. Because otherwise, why would he be so determined to find the fate of his father? Meanwhile, the case proceeds as usual. And by usual, I mean several bombshells are awarded at Genshin Asogi going missing, Gregson being found murdered, and the suspect being Lord Van Zeeks. Again, your average Tuesday and Ace Attorney, you know, it just happens. And it's only then when we meet Kazuma once again, as the prosecutor for the trial of Van Zeeks. The once prolific defense attorney was now a prosecutor. And now he's gonna be the opposition against Ryunosuke. But he's still Kazuma, right? That familiar stature and studious demeanor. He even finally regained all of his memories from his amnesia trip from last case. But something still feels different about him. The whole prosecutor stuff and white getup gives it away, but everything is just entirely the reverse of the old Kazuma. And the interaction with him is the same way. Everything is still reminiscent of your old friend, but his more hostile nature and mysterious wording are ever more apparent. And this will begin to put every single interaction beforehand into question. Looking back through even the earliest of cases, we start to see some of those cracks begin to reveal something a lot more sinister. That there was more to this London trip than meets the eye. But once again, it all comes down to another favor. Quote, "I'd like you to be there to see how it all ends." It's one final confirmation of Kazuma's trust in Ryunosuke, but whatever he could mean by it, we truly don't know yet. Nevertheless, one thing is clear. Kazuma has changed, just by how much. But at last, the trial must commence. It's trial day, now just Ryunosuke versus Kazuma. And despite the reversal in roles, Kazuma's cunningness and tenacity hasn't skipped a beat. He is straight to the point, quickly conjuring up a compelling story against Van Zeeks. And his previous experience as a defense attorney makes his style a lot more formidable than others, coming across as more calculated and logical. But at the same time, Kazuma is a lot more open-minded to hear Ryunosuke out. At least, for now. Already I love how this trial is set up. Two sides vehemently believe in their own perception of the truth and are relentlessly attempting to disprove the other's case. Now up to this point in Ace Attorney, our concept of finding the truth has been quite one-sided. The defense are always the morally right ones, always pursuing to help the innocent. Meanwhile, the prosecution is more arrogant and hostile, while also never really having a strong personal motive besides them doing a job or filling their egos. However here, both sides are established to have a strong motivation for their own perceptions of the truth. Kazuma believes that Van Zeeks had a hand in him losing his father, which he's perpetuating through the crimes of the Damask of the Reaper. Meanwhile, Ryunosuke is able to see beyond the imposing title of Reaper the Bailey and start seeing the true side to Van Zeeks. Not to mention other characters like Gina also have a personal stake in this wild case. The point is, the passion and personal ties from all sides makes her such an intriguing and dynamic trial that accelerates forward. But fast forward through the trial, Ryunosuke and Kazuma are both fiercely debating against one another. But after testimony, we reach a climax in the trial where the identity of the witness gossip comes into question. And because of Ryunosuke's incredible observation skills and out-of-the-box thinking, gossip will be revealed to be the missing warder from the beginning of the case. Daily Vigil, who also happens to be the flat owner where Gregson was murdered. And this new development would surely force further investigation and end the trial right there. That is until Kazuma interjects. And then, he starts to act a little bit off. He continues to press Vigil harder and harder about the truth of his father. This was the moment he was waiting for. Someone with an answer to what was locked away in his father's trial a decade ago. Yet, Vigil continues to plead that he has no recollection of that event. but the pressure doesn't let up. Kazuma is clearly on edge, and Ryunosuke recognizes this. He knows that this line of questioning is running on thin ice. However, the information Vigil has could be invaluable, not just for Kazuma's sake, but also for the overall case. This trial is building up to be a lot more complex than initially perceived, and throughout this entire journey, he pressed on for one thing: to always pursue the truth no matter what, to not let up like a hungry dog after a bone. That's what he lived up to do, and that's exactly what Kazuma would have done. And so, Ryunosuke relents, and he joins Kazuma in his line of questioning, as he starts rattling off stories about the professor. Vigil meanwhile is visibly growing more and more distressed as the pressure keeps ramping up, the courtroom now feeling like it's spinning. Until finally, the memories flood right back in. The professor Genshin Asogi had escaped, the prison now in chaos, and he was thrown out as the perpetrator. His entire life was over in just an instant. What now? He's finished. Everything was gone. What was there even to live for? There has always been the saying that the truth will set you free. However, the suicide attempt of Mr. Vigil was one always meant to be sealed away. One subconsciously removed from his psyche due to the trauma it caused. And now here we are. In a setting of law and order, we just forced the man to suffer his trauma once again. This is the cusp of what Kazuma has become. An entity only fueled by anger and vengeance. A pursuer of justice, but only what he deems to be right. And he will continue pursuing no matter how many rules he must break. And Ryunosuke was fully complicit in this. He enabled Kazuma to push those limits. He even helped him pushing those limits. Because from Kazuma to Sholmes to even himself, finding the truth was always the right thing to do. But was this really the right thing to do? Because they got the answers they needed, but at the cost of another man's sanity. But as much as his cross-examination was just a tipping point for Kazuma's dark downfall, it's also the point Ryunosuke finally begins to distinguish himself away from Kazuma. Kazuma's no longer the perfect lawyer he once saw him as. He's just a normal person dealing with his own demons like everyone else. Yet, I'd like to add that Kazuma's not entirely different from his original caricature. Sure, he is different, and way more malicious in fact, but it doesn't make the same mistake of making this character completely indiscernible from what he was before for the sake of subversion. Rather, it places expectations by building him up to be this perfect entity, but slowly establishing his innate flaws throughout. Details that will go overlooked or perceived as something else because of his original portrayal. A reversal of the once flawless character into the character with arguably the most flaws. And that reversal will flip every single memory from the past. His ambitious dreams to fix the legal system, now a selfish desire to provide vengeance for his father. His cocky and extravagant personality, now an aggressive and emotional mess. A once cunning defense attorney, now a calculating and vindictive prosecutor. It's still Kazuma, but now with a different context. A darker side masked by a perfect exterior. But later, we go and visit Kazuma in his office, where we will learn how this new Kazuma came to be. We learn that he's been living a life of loss and deception, his father perishing overseas, his mother passing away soon after, and every other authoritative figure lying and manipulating him. He lost every single pillar of support he had. Everyone until meeting Ryunosuke. Maybe he saw Ryunosuke as a person who will keep him in check, or maybe the person he once aspired to be before being engulfed into darkness. Maybe that was the reason he wanted him to see this trial through with him, because no matter what, Ryunosuke will always be the pillar of support he needs, the one person he could trust. And Ryunosuke sees this, and he knows that at the end of the day, Kazuma is still his best friend, no matter how much pain he is clearly dealing with. And he will continue to see him through to the very end, to help his best friend see the light once more. Which leads us to our final chapter, the resolve of Ryunosuke Naruhodo. And that title alone tells something extremely important. This is now Ryunosuke's story. It's no longer him trying to replicate the legacy of Kazuma. It's no longer him belittling himself in comparison to Kazuma. Because the one who went this journey to London, the one who became a lawyer and stuck up for what he believes to be right, the one who will finally bring an end to this case, is Ryunosuke, not Kazuma. Like what Kazuma even said himself, he wasn't the one who changed. You have, Ryunosuke. The battle between Ryunosuke and Kazuma is set to continue. Ryunosuke is going to see this trial through to the very end, but this time through his own means of uncovering the truth. As for Kazuma, he's full set on going scorched earth onto the entire courtroom, to expose every little secret locked away from him by any means necessary, even if some blood must be shed. As more details come out about Gregson's death, we discover a small blade end lodged into the victim's trunk. A small tip that would only snowball into something bigger, as Kazuma would sheath his katana and reveal its tip being missing. The same tip that was found at the crime scene. Now remember the whole "a Japanese man's katana is his soul" speech? Well, here we are now. That same soul now broken right in front of us. A perfect symbolism for a once prosperous soul now consumed by his darkest demons. A broken man only falling further into the abyss. And finally, the truth is out. The true purpose Strongheart even hinted at a while earlier. The reality is, Kazuma's entire trip to London, his mission to revolutionize Japan's legal system, was all an elaborate hoax. A lie to spare anyone else from the gruesome truth. The reality is, Kazuma was a hired assassin, one to disguise as an exchange student, killed her mark and escaped through the legal system, just like Giselle Brett from the first case. A sick plan that would seemingly go against everything he ever stood up for. Except, it was the key to get everything he ever wanted, to discover the answers always hidden from him his entire life, even if it meant a deal with the devil himself. And so, Kazuma took up an assassination plot, lied to his best friends and mentors, coerced one of those friends to become a lawyer to fall for him, double-crossed his benefactor and still continued to threaten to target's life. All because he was so desperate for answers. And that's the key difference between him and Ryunosuke. Ryunosuke is able to push back from any adversity through his compassion for others and willpower to find the truth. Meanwhile, Kazuma goes through whatever means in hopes that the truth will finally cleanse his grief. But it only further corrodes him more and more. Which leads us back to where we are now. The following day, a new man is called to the stand. The man who arguably groomed Kazuma into the person he is currently. Sashiro Jigoku. And through his testimony, we see the extent of how far Jigoku pushed Kazuma. He was one of the men who knew the fate of Genshin Asogi, but chose to continue perpetuating the lie rather than telling him the truth. And even when he knew the emotional pain Kazuma was going through, he preyed upon that weakness to dangle this London trip he was pleading for to get one final favor. And even now, when Jigoku is heavily cornered for the murder of Gregson, his last-ditch effort is to once again throw Kazuma under the bus to save himself, just showing the mere lengths this man would go through to continue to use Kazuma for his own benefit. And it's only fitting, as we will learn at the end, he was the man who put the final bullet in Genshin, and he will be the person who will bring the demise of Genshin's only son. At least, that would be the case if it wasn't for someone named Ryunosuke there to help Kazuma out. And just like that, Jigoku's reign over Kazuma is finally over. But that would not be the end of it, as Kazuma will pull out the silver bullet to finally put Van Zieks behind bars. While interrogating Gregson will reveal that the evidence used to convict his father was forged. And with those couple words, at last, Kazuma finally got it. The answer he's been laboring at for years to discover. The truth about what really happened to his father. And he was to prove that truth to the world. And once again, he hones in on Van Zieks as his prey. He's the man who forged evidence as vengeance for his brother. He's the Reaper killing defendants after every single loss. In his mind, he is right. But in reality, he's once again overtaken by his own grief and anger that he's lost every sense of logic from his former self. His bloodlust against Van Zieks only perpetuating his continual downfall. However, it would only be ironic when Van Zieks would then immediately reverse that accusation and flip it into exposing the actual suspect that Kazuma's been searching for. But it actually makes a lot of sense, because Kazuma and Van Zieks actually have a lot of parallels despite them being at odds currently. Both are haunted by the Professor case and were determined to discover their own truth by their own means, even if through immoral practices and ideologies. All of this to suppress their grief at those they idolize the most. And thus, they become blinded by their own reality that's been constantly eating away at them for a decade. But how they manage to differ in this moment all comes down to Ryunosuke. Ryunosuke was able to see beyond all the racist and passive-aggressive comments targeted towards him and see Van Zieks' true colors. A broken man only looking for answers, just like Kazuma right now. And he proved to Van Zieks that he can be an ally to him unlike Genshin before him. And that sense of trust allowed Van Zieks to change and grow as a person, becoming a better and stronger man as a result, trudging past all of his darkness and now into the light. And now, it's Kazuma's turn to see that light. Kazuma's once again pleading for the answer from them. But first, just to add some salt into the wound, Ryunosuke drops the most fucking raw line on him possible. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for the truth. This is finally the moment where Ryunosuke is forging his own path separate from Kazuma. What was once him trying to live up to Kazuma's immeasurable legacy, he is now showing his own initiative and staying true to his own ideals. And all that advice he got from Kazuma, he's now transforming it into crafting his own legacy. But the battle is only beginning, as Strongheart is now in the hot seat for the fate of Kazuma Asogi and the crimes of the Reaper. And with the accusations heating up, Strongheart spits back with thunder. He tosses out every little bit of evidence and accusation that Kazuma introduced and just stops the trial right there, immediately putting an end to Kazuma's entire revenge mission. All the sins he accumulated, the taxing years of pain and uncertainty, the relentless pursuit for answers, all that over in just an instant. The final nail in the coffin with one gavel slam. Kazuma's journey is now finished, and then he just loses it. Everything is lost. It's all due to Kazuma's own thick-headedness. His relentless belief in some fantasy that he couldn't see the writing on the wall until it was too late. But then, the doors burst open, and there comes in Herlock Sholmes to the rescue. And he rallies together the entire gallery. What's the point of being here if you're just gonna sit there and watch, he says. And then, everyone erupts into commotion. The entire gallery is starting to chant, "Testify! Testify! Testify!" And then, Kazuma's eyes start to light back up again. His mission restored just like that. But not because of him, nor Ryunosuke even, but because of everyone. Everyone combined pushing for the trial to continue. Kazuma was taught that the only person he could trust was himself. His entire life was just others lying and betraying him, and so his mission was only his to suffer, even him abandoning his closest companions right after their reunion. But this one rallying moment proves that this isn't just his fight. His truth isn't the one that matters, because this case is everyone's battle, a fight to finally uncover the truth. And just like that, the old Kazuma would begin to resurface once again. now working together with Ryunosuke and even Van Zieks to right the wrongs of the past, to bring light to the injustices against not just his father, but also everyone affected by the professor all those years ago. And after a plethora of witnesses, twists and turns, the whole truth and nothing but the truth is finally revealed. Strongheart tumbles from his throne as his entire world of corruption he built up is now in flames. Finally, there can be closure for everyone. And as we leave the courtroom for one last time, there's a nice interaction between Kazuma and Van Zieks. Both are still clearly processing from the trial, but they manage to exchange apologies for everything that happened. Nevertheless, this was the final trial to finally bring closure to everything, but also new beginnings to everyone. And as Van Zieks starts toying with retirement, who else but none other than Kazuma to convince him to continue and be a better version of himself, continuing to punish the darkness that plagues London. A mutual understanding to work together to repair their burdens, just like Clint and Genshin before them. But nonetheless, it's all over. And that means one last thing. Ryunosuke must prepare to return back to Japan. And as Ryunosuke prepares to set off at the docks, there's one last surprise interaction with Kazuma. And they exchange some heartfelt words with one another as they prepare to go on their separate paths, Ryunosuke as a defense attorney and Kazuma as a prosecutor. But then for one last surprise, Kazuma gives Ryunosuke his katana Kuruma. He was scared of what he became of in that trial, what he was capable of when he taps into his darkest side. The demons that still plague his soul and, if left unchecked, could result in a much grimmer outcome. But it also signifies Ryunosuke inheriting that mantle Kazuma built up. Or rather, that initial prosperous image we had of Kazuma is now what Ryunosuke has become. And it's now his legacy he will continue on his journey. His resolve that will persist till the very end. And finally, the ship begins to take off. A new journey awaiting our two lawyers, one to bring change and revolution, while the other picking up the pieces of what he destroyed. But nonetheless, their paths will realign, whenever the time is right. And so, that was the Great Ace Attorney. And what else can I say besides this game was an absolute masterpiece? And one of those reasons was because of Kazuma's entire character arc. A character that I honestly didn't care much for at the beginning, only seeing him as a standard mentor character to serve as motivation for the protagonist. But this game managed to twist that trope and transform this character in such an interesting way even from the very beginning, making him this multi-layered character with his own individual strengths and flaws. He has every aspect that makes him seem like this heroic figure, but his underlying flaws and broken self is what makes him feel human. But Kazuma's story wouldn't have been so effective if it wasn't for how intertwined all these characters are to each other, from Van Zieks to Suzuto to especially Ryunosuke. Characters that either cared about him or were deeply affected by him. All the repercussions of Kazuma and his actions reverberate through the entire cast, and you see how much you're affected by him in a way that feels realistic. Kazuma makes these characters feel more alive and vice versa. And even after talking for like 40 minutes straight, I still feel like I'm barely scratching the surface about Kazuma and this entire game really. I'm still learning new things about them even a year later, and that's just crazy to me. And I probably will do a follow-up video talking about those things I missed, so any extra questions or comments would be much appreciated. But regardless, there's just so many complexities behind the storyline of Kazuma. One who's very much the victim by circumstance, but also the one fanning the flame into something uncontrollable. But that's all in the past now. He may still be broken, but he's very much a new man. And wherever his journey leads to next, he will make sure he will right the wrongs of the past, to build a better future for himself and everyone he cares about. This has been the story of Kazuma Asogi.